traditionally what happens is a soldier will set up a company in his mid-40s with his payoff and his pension from the army there to sort of secure things for him. And he'll start, either set up something or work in a friend's company that they set up together. And the main industries that they set up are to do with the homeland security industry. This is a huge global industry now, homeland security. And if you have the kind of knowledge that you get from running an occupation, the Israeli army is running an occupation. It's been running an occupation for decades, more than 4 decades now. There's a wealth of institutional knowledge there. But there's also huge opportunities to experiment on a live population, Palestinian population. You've got millions of Palestinians who are under occupation, their lives entirely controlled by the army. And the army is always looking for new ways to control that population and new kinds of technologies that it can use. Remember, Israel was the country that invented the drone, this unmanned aerial vehicle that goes around, these small planes, some of them are very large now, unmanned, with cameras on them. They can see what's going on, they can zoom in. The Americans are using these in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the Israelis invented these things to use them in South Lebanon, way back in the early 80s. That's a very good example of one of these kind of homeland security industries that started even before the people talked about homeland security. But now there are so many different ways you can advance a kind of occupation as the American occupations are entrenching and becoming more contracted out. And what you're seeing in the Middle East with Iraq and Afghanistan increasingly is subcontractors running things. And the Israelis are brilliant at doing this kind of stuff. And there are lots of them, lots of ex-army people who retired at 42, still got a career ahead of them, money in the bank, who are looking for new ways to exploit this need to control population groups. It's easy for Israel to use the occupation as a way to experiment on how to control people, how to keep populations captive, how to keep them fragmented. We've seen that increasingly with Gaza and the West Bank as separate entities. Israel has developed that very much through a process of divide and rule, but in a very sophisticated new kind of form. Urban warfare, new kinds of urban warfare. You know, Gaza is an incredible laboratory from Israel's point of view. It's a very small space with a very large number of people, 1.5 million Palestinians trapped into a tiny area on the coast. Israel has fenced them in, is now controlling the sea so they can't get in or out that way, controls the air, surrounds them on all sides. You know, I can't think of another situation in the world where one country has been able to so completely imprison another. And so really the technologies that they're developing to do that, the administrative and bureaucratic mechanisms that are needed, the whole infrastructure of that, you know, keeping control of the population records. Israel controls the population records for Gaza. So they know who's born, where they live. They know everything about Gaza, even though they're not actually physically present most of the time there. And I think Israel also realizes that there's money to be made from this. I mean, and influence, particularly in America, because this whole technological control mechanism that it's developed can be exported, it can be used by other countries, particularly America, as we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan, using similar kinds of technologies, similar kinds of ways of thinking, similar attitude towards the Arab mentality, as it's called. You know, it's Israelis who came up with this whole doctrine of the Arab mind and how to understand it, and how to destroy it and how to crush it. And the American military are reading these manuals that the Israelis developed decades ago. So this is something really a powerful, not only financial money-making exercise for Israel, but also gives it a position of influence, global influence, gives it power within Washington. So in all these ways, it's an incredibly important thing for Israel to have these occupied territories and use them, exploit them as laboratories. I'll give you a good example of a new kind of system that Israel has developed recently, which is being used. It was developed by a private company run by former Israeli soldiers, but they've sold the technology to the Israeli army, and the Israeli army now uses it in Gaza, and I dare say they will export it to other countries. It's called spot and shoot, is a translation from Hebrew, And what you have is, around Gaza you have an electronic fence that keeps the population contained, imprisoned. But you obviously have the potential problem, which is that Palestinians might decide that they're not prepared to live in a prison, and they might come to this fence and try and tear it down. So what Israel has done is installed a series of on the top of towers all around Gaza, remotely controlled machine guns, and with video cameras next to them. And interestingly, what they've done is that they've put in charge of these remotely controlled machine guns young women, typically 19 or 20 years old, 18, 19, 20, who are doing their military service, conscription. Israel has created a huge buffer zone around Gaza of sometimes up to 500 metres, where Palestinians are not allowed to enter. Gaza is a very small area, so 500 metres, half a kilometre, is quite a long way into Gaza. If anybody goes into that area and they're seen on the video camera, the women alert their senior officer. The senior officer will then likely give permission to shoot, and they effectively can execute a Palestinian from a remote base somewhere else. All they need to do it's like a PlayStation. You press a button, it fires the machine gun and kills the person, and it happens. That's now being used regularly around Gaza.
Why women?
Why women? Because women, in a way, the Israeli army, the women are the least useful members of the Israeli army, from the Israeli army's point of view. They don't do combat traditionally, and therefore, if you need soldiers to do combat, there is a problem with the Israeli army. There are an increasing number of Israeli Jews who don't serve. The Palestinian community inside Israel don't serve. So you have a shrinking number of people who are serving, and you have fewer and fewer who are prepared to put themselves into combat situations, and die. Be in danger of being killed. And so if you can create these kind of technologies, remote technologies, where soldiers have the power to kill the enemy, in this case Palestinian, sometimes civilians as well, they have the power to kill or wound, but without putting themselves in danger. And that's obviously women are. It doesn't violate certain taboos in Israeli society. There are taboos against putting Israeli women in dangerous situation where they might get killed. Well, with these remotely controlled technologies, you don't need to do that. The women can kill, they can be combat soldiers without ever being in any danger.